can you hear me? Okay, I'm not going to use the mic. So the title of my talk this evening is The Danger of a Single Story: How We Can Disrupt the Model Minority Stereotype of Asians in the United States via Counter Storytelling. Notice I said in the United States, so much of what we'll talk about today is in the context of the United States, because the model minority stereotype exists outside of North America. So without further ado, next slide. So Dr. Smith mentioned, some work that I've already done on this insidious stereotype. Before I begin, let me just make two cautions of tonight's talk. One, there is some graphic material we're going to have to engage with. So you might feel uncomfortable. If you need to leave the room, certainly do so. But I felt, compelled to share with you some of this graphic material. Second, I think of the model minority stereotype as a bikini. Because what it reveals is suggestive, but what it conceals is vital for its continuation and perpetuation. Here's some work that I've already engaged with. I will kind of jump off from these books through tonight's talk. But all I can say is, when I was driving up from up south or down south, as we call it, right, is, what would be of benefit and use to share, right, for the 4 hours, 3 hours of driving. Because some of you might have already known about this stereotype, some of you might have read other books. And so I hope it's educational. I hope there is I'm not going to say entertainment, but enjoyment piece of tonight's talk. Stories. Dr. Smith talked about Benjamin. I remember Benjamin when I taught at Hartford, right? And as a first, second grade teacher, you have to teach kids stories. Anyone previously a teacher or currently a teacher? Okay. And I'm biased. I'm an early childhood background guy, but when you have the paper and you fold it, and then you have the kids cut twice, and then you got 3 flaps. You got a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? A story. We tend to teach kids, there's a beginning, you introduce something, there's a middle, and there's an end. There's a sandwich, right? You got the buns and you got the meat. You got the hot dog, right? We teach kids this. We teach kids about an exposition of the story, the rising action, a climax, a falling action, and a resolution, right? Beginning, middle, and an end. In the beginning, in the exposition, we talk about where the characters and the setting are. Right? I've already told you that in this story. It's the United States. The actors are Asian Americans. And others. We'll get to that. The rising action, where the main character faces a series of conflicts. Right? We'll get to that too. Right? It's the Horatio Alger myth. All of these conflicts, all of these hard situations, but then inevitably success. Right? The climax, the most exciting part of the story when we learn about the outcome, right? When we hear narratives of doctors, engineers, right? Model minorities, right? It's really makes us feel good. And then the falling action, events leading to the end of the story, right? Well, what's the end of the story of the model minority stereotype? Dr. Smith mentioned his roommate, right? Who said, right, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. That's one falling action. We'll get some more. And then ultimately the end of the story, which I would say is the beginning of the story, right? The model minority stereotype, right, is both sides of the same coin. And we'll get to that. What motivated me for the title of tonight's talk is Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk. And if you haven't looked up her TED Talk, it is powerful. I recommend you to do that. If you got a smartphone, put it in. Don't watch it while I'm talking tonight. but look it up. And this is an excerpt from her talk. She says this: how stories are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. And that is what I'm going to share with you today. However, I'm going to substitute Asian for African, Asian American for Asian within the context of America. Okay. How stories are told, right? What's being emphasized in the story? What facts, statistics, and or evidence is shared in the story? We're going to get to this, but the model minority stereotype, I think of it as creamy peanut butter, because it homogenizes all Asians together into this substance of just success, right? It's not chunky peanut butter where there's diversity and heterogeneity, right? It is all Asians. And oftentimes the stereotype relies on aggregate statistics. If you haven't, right, if you're not really familiar with statistics, right, the whole point of statistics is variation, right? And when there's no variation and we're all right here, central tendency right here, right, we lose a lot of explanations, a lot of power, right? Also evidence. The stereotype of Asian success really relies on cherry-picking circumstantial evidence to support its argument and thesis, which, if you haven't looked at the work of Barbara Fields and her sister, on racecraft, I see an element of racecraft going on here. What is overlooked, omitted, or forgotten in the story, and even before we think of forgotten, untold, right? Asian American history before George Stakaki really was limited and or non-existent. Here you have a great scholar, Chia, who does work right on Hmong experiences. So without those important contributions, let's forget untold. Let's start thinking of never even told, right? And absent. What is the context of the story? I will tell you some context of stories, counter stories. And maybe there's stories you've heard. Maybe they're new stories to you. But hopefully they'll help give you a context of what I'm sharing with you tonight. Okay. So first, we need to begin before the model minority stereotype was created in the United States. Because in China, it was created at a different time. That's a different lecture. Chia's going to have to invite me back to give that talk. But within the context of the U.S., right, was in 1965, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Now, Moynihan, he was a Ph.D., but at the point when he authored this report, he was then Assistant Secretary of Labor. And that report really demonized blacks and African Americans for having a culture of poverty, which we know doesn't exist, but at this time, was very sexy, right? It was a vehicle to point out family differences in which black families were really racialized and understood as being pathological, being, not caring, and then also highlighting crime and delinquency of blacks. And you notice even in the title, they use Negro. I mean, you know the context in 65, that language was common parlance, right, in the lexicon. Okay. 1965, that report came out. 1 year later, this man, William Peterson, wrote for the Times, New York Times Magazine, Success Story, Japanese American Style. Now, something that you might not know, hopefully this is the one thing that you came here and you leave with knowing. Peterson had no real working knowledge of Japanese Americans. In fact, Daryl Hamamoto, if you read his book Monitored Peril, he says this. He says, the New York Times Magazine came to Peterson asking him, basically commissioning him to write this article. And they said, William, write an article about a successful ethnic racial group that's doing good despite persecution. Well, duh, he thought, well, Japanese, right? Internment, they're going to be prosperous. I'll write about them. But Daryl Hamamoto said, right, Peterson had no working knowledge, but yet he took the project on no matter what. And in this story, Peterson really, he's quoted as being the creator, the originator of this term, despite the model minority stereotype not obviously being included word for word. But he set in motion this discourse that I'm going to unpack for us today. Okay. Now, stories. We already said stories are important to have a context. I want to compare and contrast a few factors. Intention and impact, right? The Moynihan Report. I would argue it was intentional, right? It's part of black racism, right? Racism towards blacks that, right? The family was highlighted. Moynihan wrote that at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family. When he talked about crime and deviance, it was framed in such a way that, quote, he said, the combined impact of poverty and isolation among Negro youth has had the predictable outcome in a disastrous delinquency and crime rate. That was the first story. In the wake of that report, Peterson offered another discourse, another story, and his story went something like this. Japanese family, right? Japanese Americans of whatever faith are distinguished by their greater attachment to family, their greater respect for parental and other authority. You hear these terms, filial piety, right, and this commitment to family or Confucian values, right? Also embedded within Peterson's success story was, again, highlighting crime and delinquency. In such a slum environment, even though surrounded by ethnic groups with high crime rates, they have been exceptionally law-abiding. Now, see, you have to understand, by having a story that says blacks are criminal, they're deviant, they don't value family, and then in the wake of that, telling a story that Asians, Japanese Americans value family, and they are not deviant, they're in fact law-abiding, what you get is a comparison and a contrast that is very dangerous. Jean Claire Kim calls it racial triangulation, when you have whites, blacks, and Asians, right? And I'm not going to talk about that today. It's important, if you're not familiar with her work, to look at it. But I'm going to share something different. You can go to the next slide. Now, who are the storytellers? Who are the actors? Well, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others. Right? We can say Patrick Moynihan et al. Peterson, and I always say not Peterson because people who don't know how to spell, they misspell names. I'm a big stickler on that, right? Because when you read the articles, you'll notice that it's an E-N, not an O-N. Sorry, that's an aside. Whites, certainly, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans in the media. Clearly, there are some Asians who are perpetuating the stereotype. Anyone hear of Amy Chua and her triple package book and the Tiger Parenting, right? She's benefiting buco bucks for those book contracts, right? But that's very dangerous. And we'll get to Amy Chua later. But certainly, there are many actors, there are many storytellers, and the media. So we're going to go to the next slide. Media. Now the media represents Asians, right, in different ways. They're not just the doctors, they're not just engineers, right? They're not IT geeks. Women. Asian women are objectified sexually, right? They exist for man's pleasure in certain portrayals. Bruce Lee, Kung Fu fighters, right? Now it's really interesting how the media has the Asians as the bad guys and then sometimes even uses yellowface and race bending for whites to beat Asians, but somehow the Karate Kid is a white guy, or in the newest one is a black boy, and they just do awesome at martial arts, right? There we go. In the background, this is a forthcoming edited book that I've edited with Bradley Porfilio. And if you notice in the background of the cover, we have a Japanese artist, and I told him, I said, Tack, make us a really cool book cover. And Killing the Monomite, this is what he came up with, right? And I think it's dope, because in the back you see the different types of stereotypes. You heard of the not a Chinaman's chance, right? We have a lot of these stereotypes, and in the back, if you're not, right, and then the Asian fighter there. But he looks real upset. So that just reveals a little bit of, I have a little spice to me. I'm a little edgy, right? And so I thought it was awesome. All right, now this, Dr. Smith, is a video. Before you play it though, I just want to give a context. This is the moment where we're going to enter into some graphic language. So just be aware of that. This is a clip from Gran Torino. Clint Eastwood directed and also starred in the picture in 2008. And so we'll play this for you. Just take a listen to the clips.
Killing you to buy America. Did you see the way they did the trial? It's like Bryce Burner this, Jeff Burner that, you know.
How many swamp rats can get in one room and have some respect separated? Look at that evidence. What the hell? The Shinks have to move into this neighborhood for. I kept a bunch of jabbering gooks off of my lawn when we were in Korea, and 1,000 screaming gooks came across our line. We didn't call the police. Yeah, well, you shouldn't be hanging out with them. You should be hanging out with your own people, the other among. What is it? Jungle people want to be in the great frozen sun.
Kill people.
What are all you fish heads looking at anyway? These gooks and that little spoiled Broadway family. They're like separated. You're wrong, Abel. I know exactly what I'm talking about. You're letting Click Clack Ding Dong and Charlie Chan just walk out with Miss What's-Her-Face.
You mean Bjorn?
Yeah, yeah. Nice girl. Joseph and Mary is one brother, so like badgers. All you slopes are supposed to be good at math, right? These swamp rats, on the other hand, you just now listen to me. Now you listen, old man. Look, I'm just kidding, Zip. You get the wrong one, you're gonna blow your gook head right off.
Now, come on, Zip. Let the Mig stay here.
You want to kill that cousin of yours and the rest of those Zips? Take out a chain machine gun nest. Yeah, some scared little gook just like you. These swamp rats in there. Shut up, gook. Give me another beer, Dragon Lady.
So a lot, he made a reference, Clint Eastwood, of gook a lot, zip, zipperhead. Also this last one, a female epithet. And I want us to hold on to those verbal exchanges. And I understand Clint Eastwood was acting here. But yet, I have a problem with this. Has anyone seen this movie, the entire, right? How he's kind of redeemed at the end, right? So that's, right, this narrative. But I just wanted to highlight those exchanges because it gets the storytelling and the repetition, the more we hear it, Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Now, this is another video. Before we play it, it's short. Anyone watch Family Guy? I don't have cable, but YouTube is nice. So compliments of YouTube. This is from Family Guy. Listen to is it Stewie or what's the main person's name?
Peter.
Pardon?
Which one?
The white boy or man?
The baby Stewie.
Stewie?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll play it and then you tell me who it was. Okay, here we go.
You guys notice how many Asians there are at this school? How do they all get so smart?
I don't know. Guess that's just the way God made them.
Gentlemen, I give you the Asian. Ooh. Compact, hairless, and fiercely intelligent. The Petersons, while tiny, are extremely efficient. We're projecting 10 billion within 5 years. Also Also, there'll be different varieties that will all hate each other for some reason.
Do they eat just like regular food?
No, the opposite.
Who was that then?
That was Peter.
Peter? Okay. We'll go to the next slide. Right. Here's two covers on magazines, 84 and 87, I believe. If you notice, not only the aesthetics of the Asian body, the Asian American body, right? They're very much East Asian looking. But there are clues within that really symbolize and codify this notion of Asian superiority. You got Stanford emblazoned his chest. You have the geeky little girl in front of the computer with glasses. You have the, we'll get to it, the stereotypical chinky eyes. And you see a sense of, I want to say, contentment and happiness. Right? It's very one-sided. Okay. So Adichie also said how many stories are told. I want to bring our attention to discourse, right? Foucault traces the role of discourses and wider social processes of legitimating and power, emphasizing the construction of current truths, how they are maintained, and what power relations they carry with them. So very much the stereotype, and this is true in stereotype literature. Take, for instance, you're in New York. Raise your hand if you've ever been in New York. Okay. I was just there a while ago. So you're in New York and you're in a taxi cab. And you take a notice of who's your driver. And you exit the taxi cab and you go to your hotel and it's great. And then say you go, the next day you take another taxi cab. You go and you notice who the taxi cab driver is, and then you leave and you go on to your conference. And the more times you enter a taxi cab and leave, you'll come away with a false impression. You might think, right, that all taxi cab drivers are Pakistani, or you come away with an understanding. And then you go to another city, let's say Philadelphia. Anyone been to Philadelphia? AERA was just at Philadelphia. You go to Philadelphia and you get in a taxi cab there. And you remember every time that there's a Pakistani driver, but you fail to realize every time maybe there's a white cab driver. And so they're called sedimented perceptions, right? Implicit biases. This is an excerpt from the Model Minority Stereotype Reader, one of the books of the three on the second slide I shared. And I want to highlight this sentence. It says, because it is predominantly discursive in nature, which, right, lacking physical proof of the ideology, the model minority system is presented as apolitical. We have to understand, first and foremost, the model minority stereotype is, in fact, racist. But how can that be, Dr. Hartlep? That doesn't make sense. It's a positive stereotype, isn't it? I would much rather have a positive stereotype than a negative stereotype. That's myopic thinking. Let me unpack it for us. By uplifting Asians, you're simultaneously oppressing other people. Because if they're doing good relative to others. I think of the stereotype very much through a lens of a racialized epithet. Or what Edward Bonilla de Silva talks about is colorblind racism or semantic moves, right? And Bonilla Silva's work is great. And basically it gets at, some of the things that it gets at is this idea of semantic moves. Semantic moves might be like this. I'm not racist, but, or I have a black friend, I have an Asian friend. His research is really telling because what he's found is young folks are better at using semantic moves than older folks. That's not to say older folks are just overt racist bigots and younger kids are better at concealing it. But it is to say that the stereotype, the discourse and language, the way we talk about Asians is a way to talk nasty about them. There's an article, How to Talk Nasty About Blacks Without Sounding Racist. Right? It's the same for Asians. we're substituting race with culture. Did you notice that? We highlight Asian culture that explains their success, right? By replacing race with culture, colorblind races and race relations in general, that doesn't come across as being racist. What comes across being racist nowadays is, right, if you use the N-word, or you're in our minds we have these interpersonal, like, I'm going to hang someone, that's racist. We don't think of institutionalized racism. We don't think about microaggressions, micro-invalidations, micro-insults. So the mono-minority stereotype is in fact racist. Okay. Let's get to the power analysis with the Family Guy clip. There was hints at biological determined intelligence, the eugenics movement. Did you notice, what was the man's name again? Peter. Peter said, hairless, short, and despite their small penis size, is very effective, right? So the penis size is a very much embedded stereotype, which is a form of castration of males, right? That males are eunuchs in some respects. But then, right, there's also this hyperfemininity of what it means to be an Asian American woman, right? They're fetishized, right? I mean, there's a whole genre of pornography, right? Let's think about the Gran Torino for a moment. Clint Eastwood really talked a lot about zippers, zipper heads, gook. And I think of, in parentheses, I think it's going really from, right, the stereotype is going from gook to geek back to gook. Or yellow peril to model minority back to yellow peril. Or satyr to saint. Or pariah to paragon, right? That's all the alliteration I have for you. But it's this change. We'll go to the next slide. Now, eugenics as a pseudoscientific, this idea that intelligence is biological, you just have to look at the literature. Here you have Philippe Rushton. He's recently passed. In 1997, he published this article in a peer-reviewed journal, and the journal, guess the title of the journal? Intelligence. But the title was Cranial Size and IQ in Asian Americans from Birth to Age 7. Now again, how I said context matters, you need to understand that 2 years before this article came out, he published a book, Race, Evolution, and something, in which he talked about penis size. And what his contention was this: black men had large, long penises. They were very aggressive and very dumb. White men, on the other hand, had average-sized penises, moderate aggression, normal aggression, and, normal intelligence, but closer to the higher end of intelligence. And Asians had small penises, very low aggression, and very high intelligence. In fact, Rushton and other eugenicists have gotten into trouble by the IRB because of some of the crazy shit they had their subjects do. Now, I don't want to talk about Nuremberg Code violations, but yeah. Now, Richard Lynn, right, 2012, published an article that really resuscitated this stereotype. Look at the title. Dr. Smith, can you read, because it's closer, my vision. An examination of Rushton's K-theory of difference, circumference, and blah, 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 blah. And basically, his study and his report and his article really supports this notion. And Rushton, among many crazy theories, he had this idea, right, that there are some people who have a lot of babies, right? They have a lot of children. Like animals. There's some animals that just have lots of animals, they have a lot of babies, and they don't take care of them. They might take care of them for 1 day or 2 days, and then they're off, and they have to survive. And the point is, we have to put a lot of babies out there because only like 10% will live. And there's some animals, right, mammals, that have only a few babies, and they nurture, and they take care of them, and they help them, and they right? like humans and other animals. Well, he kind of substituted, right? So, right, as part of the welfare queen myth and the stereotype is that some races have a lot of babies and they don't care for it, and others are more delicate, right? Very dangerous, very dangerous. But he is a storyteller. He's a storyteller. Let's go to the Clint Eastwood Gran Torino movie for a moment. Zipperhead. Now, I will be honest. I've heard pretty much, and I've been told that I'm such and such, but I've never been told I was a zipperhead. So I had to look it up. A derogatory term used in reference to people of Asian descent. It is said to have been coined during the Korean or Vietnam War by frontline troops whom had run over enemy troops in jeeps. The soldiers claimed that the tire tracks from the jeeps left a pattern resembling that of a closed zipper along the corpse. I don't have empirical evidence to support that. I don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me if that's true. But one thing I do know is that there have been politicians, well-known politicians, John McCain being one of them, who have openly used gook in many speeches and talks. In fact, there's a book I encourage you to look up. It's something to the effect of gook and John McCain's racism. I understand his experience in a prison of war camp, being a prisoner of war. I get that. But part of me would hope that our politicians who represent our democracy and people would not use insensitive and racist language, like gook. All right, next slide. Now, this is the moment, and we're getting to the point where some more graphic language, but I want to share some critical race case counter stories with you for a moment. Next slide. I was thinking, right, when Dr. Vang, invited me to talk with you, being in this state of Wisconsin, what stories could I share that were local? Or glocal, as I would say, because what's going on here in Wisconsin is going on everywhere. So a glocal representation, but something that would hit home. Not only that, the fact that it's part of the Hmong studies and history department. So I want to bring our attention to this story and counter story. Look at the bumper sticker for a moment. Save a deer, kill a Hmong. Here's the story. You may have heard Chai Su Vang, who shot some hunters, right, who were also hunting in the mid-2000s, right? I was in my second year of college. That dates me, so you now know my age. In 2004, I was a sophomore in college. The story went something like this. This incident occurred, and these hunters were killed, and some were, not all were killed, but some were killed. And then, shortly after that incident, bumper stickers in northern Wisconsin started appearing. And they said, save a hunter, kill a Hmong, shoot a Hmong. But the story was that Hmong wasn't Hmong, as Clint Eastwood said, right? It was M-U-N-G. It was an acronym. And the acronym went something like this. Minuscule, unseen, naughty net. First, wow, whoever created that took a lot of time. But we have to understand that, and I will share in the counter story, that Hmong was Hmong, which implied it's okay to kill Hmong people, Hmong hunters. But we have to understand that acronyms is part of everyday language used to talk nasty about Asian folk. Let me give you a few examples. I'm going to say something, you tell me what the acronym stands for as fast as possible. I'm trying to engage you because people I see are like, oh, just eat it, right? All right, be ready. As you see, I'm going to say something, you shout it out as loud as possible. MIT.
Milwaukee Institute of Technology.
Made in Taiwan. UCLA.
University. Los Angeles, University of California.
University of Caucasians lost among Asians. All right, you ready for this one? Get ready. It's like Jeopardy. UBC. University of a Billion Chinese. This goes on and on and on, right? Alexandra Wallace, if you haven't seen her rant, you can look on YouTube. She was a student at UCLA who was ranting and raving about Asians in the library. But we have to understand that language is so important. And I don't believe for one moment that that stands for Hmong, this little gnat, right? It's part of discourse. So here's the mainline story, or go back one. The mainline story was, right, wounded, and then he was found guilty of all 6 charges, intentional homicide. So that's the stock story or the master narrative. Okay, now we'll go to the next one. The counter story. Hmong means Hmong. And that, in fact, that bumper sticker was racist. Chai Su Bang was frightened, and maybe he was even verbally threatened by the white victims, right? Maybe he didn't understand it. There's a language barrier. Hmong hunting culture during the master narrative was really highlighted a lot. Well, that might have been true. That, right, in America, in the U.S., we have private property and hunting grounds are off limits to some, so maybe there was a misunderstanding. Here's another story, counter story. Goes something like this, yes, racism happens, but there are more good people than bad people. We just need to blow off the incidences when Asians get picked on. Toughen up, you're a model minority. So you got a Starbucks, right? You're Asian, you go into Starbucks, and those eyes are written on your cup. Just deal with it, right? That's the story. Okay. Well, the story, right? Asians are accepted. They're model minorities. Okay. Counter story. Actually, this happens quite frequently for Asians. Right? You have receipts. Huffington Post did a long story. I think a book should be written, Racist Receipts, where there's another alliteration for you. That, right, you have folks, you go in, and your aesthetics of being an Asian or Asian American in the United States, they write chong or ching chong, lady chinky eyes. What does that really say about the worth of that Asian person or Asian American person? Less than human. Very problematic, clearly. Okay. Here's another counter story for you. A while back, there was an app on Google Play, Make Me Asian app. Right? So you got this white gal morphed into an Asian, I guess. Somehow, having this patty hat now makes her Asian. And changing her phenotypical, right, her facial expression, her eyes have really changed her, right? But again, remember, East Asian. We're not talking South Asian, we're talking East Asian. Okay. What about this case? I was out in San Francisco. Anyone flying to San Francisco? It's tight, right? It's like, ooh. The only worse airport than that is like Korea and or Ecuador when you're flying between the mountains, right? But Asiana Flight 214 came in too low and did a nosedive. And this is a screenshot from a news report or a news channel story on it. These are the names of those pilots. Now, before I read the names, I want to highlight something. I watched the news channel report, and this is what they said. Something like it. It's been confirmed by TSA that we have the names of the Asian pilots. And here are the names. Captain Something Wong. We too low. Holy fuck. Bang ding out. Right? Now, I can get the first three. Does anyone know what that last one's about? Holy fuck, we're too low, and Captain, something wrong. What's the last one?
Crash.
Banging out. I don't get it, but we know clearly those are falsified names. There's no way that those names, in fact, those names are wrong. This is part of everyday language that's used to talk nasty. And first and foremost, before you release names, verify it. Please, verify. Okay. Now, here's a clip. The last clip will play, very graphic, just to forewarn you. Let me give you a little context. And since I used this example in my class, I recently found out that this gentleman's in trouble. Does anyone know who he is? He's a state senator, State Senator Yee, Democrat in California. And he, for this, was basically called and had a death threat. Now, the death threat was on his voice recording. In addition, there were paper pamphlets that basically were going to kill you. So we'll play this and take a listen.
I saw on the news that you want people to boycott Rush Limbaugh because he made a joke or something about like Chinaman or something, that president or whatever deal's name is from China. Well, I don't really listen to Rush Limbaugh hardly ever because I think he's a dumb adult. But I'm going to listen to someone start listening to Rush Limbaugh because I think you're just a little crybaby, little chink kid. Two-headed piss ass. That's fucking stupid. A chinka. Oh, emperor. Good God, what a crybaby. Dude, why don't you just resign from office rather, and go get a, roll in an unfortunate cookie and eat it. God, what a chink-headed chink-duker. Really, man. You know, that's pathetic. Boycott Rush. You know, that Chinese president that was here to go fuck himself, he shouldn't run into hell. I hope he has a heart attack. That goddamn China. Fuck China. I hope China just falls on down in the damn river or the ocean or whatever. Fuck China. I hate China. Fuck China. Fuck China. And fuck you, you chink. Fuck China. Fuck China. Fuck China. You got it? Fuck China. Fuck China. I hope China goes under. You got it? Chink.
To replay, push 7.
We'll go to the next slide. So before I explain this next slide, the caller, and I've written about it in articles, there's no definitive evidence to say and to suggest he's white, but there are some codes and clues to key in. The comments, were very nationalistic, talking about China. And we have to also understand the relationship of the model minority stereotype of the perpetual foreigner, an alien in the homeland, that you're never, as an Asian, with the aesthetics of being Asian American, truly American, which is evidenced in the internment camps, or concentration camps as they really were, for Japanese Americans who did nothing wrong, let's return for a moment to the beginning, middle, and in the end, the way we teach kids stories, Exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. The model minority stereotypical discourse has an exposition, and I would say the exposition is something like this. Once pariahs, Asian Americans are quickly becoming paragons of success. Despite historical issues, historical oppressions, the Transcontinental Railroad, they're being successful now. The rising action, Asian American success stories, they abound based on circumstantial evidence that really support the Horatio Algernon. There's a climax, Asian American overachievement. This is the point that is really important for us to really understand. The model minority stereotype, it is not positive. Because when we highlight Asian success, there's only so much success that whiteness can tolerate. Right? And so we have to look at the following action. The yellow peril on Asian invasion discourses. The UCLA, like I said, University of Caucasians lost among Asians. That's a discourse. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, made in Taiwan, that's a discourse. University of a Billion Chinese, UBC is in Canada, University of British Columbia, right? There's work that talks about how Canadians have imported the discourse from the United States, right? They're discourses. In the resolution, right, white resentment, white victimhood, and the new white flight. There's some stories on the internet if you look up the new white flight. It's just this idea that when there's a tipping point in areas, when schools become too saturated with Asians, white people flee. Well, they flee because they're fearful. They say, wow, look at all these Asians. Now my kid has to compete against all these Asian kids. I'm just going to move. When the original intent of white flight was to get away from black people or racial containment, right? So those discourses really are problematic because then you go to Cupertino and Palo Alto, around Stanford, and you have high concentrations of South Asians, Chinese, nationals, and domestic folk, and white people fleeing. The resolution, well, the rules change. The status quo remains intact, right? The maintenance that Foucault talked about, the maintenance that I introduced in the earlier slides. Okay. Danger of a single story. Well, the single story of success, if we just only highlight success stories, it overlooks heterogeneity by modality and diversity of the population. It misunderstands educational attainment, and it does not recognize inequitable return on investment. Click it once. We do not think about this population very much when it comes to Asians within the popular mainstream, right, of unsuccessful Asians. Right? Try to write a book about unsuccessful Asians, see how well it sells. However, you do find books like Tiger Mom, How to Raise Your Kid to Go to Harvard. Go on Amazon, and there's many books like it, written by Asians and non-Asians. Again, who are the storytellers? Amy Chua's of the world. There's two Korean gals, an MD and a lawyer who wrote a book on raising children the Asian way or something like that. Okay, one more click. We always perseverate. We really focus our attention on this high achieving. The Asian American population is bimodal. There's two modes, right? If you're in a statistics course, bimodality, you talk about that. We never think about the lower rung. We always think about the upper rung. Okay. What about the educational attainment? If you disaggregate Asian Americans, right? You take the creamy peanut butter and somehow magically you can make it into crunchy peanut butter and it's different. You see subgroup differences. You see intergroup differences and you see intra-group differences, right? On what they attain. That's super important. Right? One thing about stats, right? You think about fallacies, ecological fallacies. When you make these generalizations, populational generalizations based and predicated on subgroups, right? And if maybe I'm bringing up old memories of certain folks, and if there's any stats professors in the room, I'm sorry, I'm picking on you, but right, this whole idea of null hypothesis testing and falsification, right? So, like, is it that what makes a dog? Is it the fact that it has a tail? Well, no, because cats have tails too. So a dog is not a cat, right? So we can't make these faulty inferences based on, well, the Koreans are doing really well, so all Asians are doing well. Or the mom, a lot have less than high school, so all Asians are, right? It's very dangerous when we do that. Okay. What about earning power? Here you have a gendered and racialized graphic for earning power. Return on investment, right? You go to college and you get a credential and your lifetime earnings, right? Many PhDs in the room. Maybe there's some people that haven't completed high school in the room, but you see the differences among races and genders. Now, what race would you want to be if it meant to make the most money? A white. What gender? A man, right? And so it's interesting to look at this analysis for a moment. If Asians and Asian Americans were model minorities, you would see that they would be making more money, right? It makes sense. If you're some superhuman, you should be making superhuman loads of money. But that is not true. There is no evidence that suggests that. Meanwhile, right, I already talked about aggregation. Meanwhile, you have statisticians who say, well, Asians, their households have so much more money than white people. Well, you have to disaggregate that by per capita. How many earners are in? It's not a man who goes to work and a stay-at-home mom in an Asian family. You might have multiple people contributing to that income, which would lead you to falsely believe that they're making more money than the white family. It's not true. How can we disrupt the model minority stereotype of Asians in the United States via counter storytelling? Well, first, Asian critical race theory is an excellent tool. Also, counter stories or stories in general are memorable. And there is research that indicates that it is a great vehicle for instruction at the PK-20 level. That students and people remember stories, right? I think of Toni Morrison, who said something to the effect of, students will never remember all the stuff you tell them per se, but they'll remember how you made them feel. I think it's similar, that you can tell them compelling stories and engaging stories and affective stories, or you can give them notes. So there is research that says using storytelling is good. We need to teach history well. We need more historians to write about the Asian American experience, because if not, that history will not be there. But then second, we can't fall prey to amnesia. The Linsanity thing, we could have talked about Linsanity. What struck me about that is how everyone was saying they were enraged that ESPN would write chink in the armor. How dare they? And I'm not condoning that. Certainly I was pissed that they did that, and I was upset, and it was racist. What I was pissed about and enraged about were folks, not only Asian American folks, but social justice folks, who were not decrying that this stuff was going on 14 years before this. MSNBC's website had a similar story that implied, right, Michelle Kwan was not American. We cannot forget history. And if history's not there, we got problems, so we need more historians. Lastly, I think we need to move beyond oppression stories. You know, I get this, like, critical, I'm a critical theorist, but it gets depressing. The more you're like, oh, this isn't a bad example or this. We need to write about and hear about what might Asian Americans be or become. What does it mean, right? Identity work. What does it mean to be an Asian American in the 21st century? What hopes do you have, right? The creative class. We need to hear those narratives, not just the oppression sweepstakes, as it's been called, right? Because going back, what did I say? The stories that are told and how frequently they're told become reified and reinforced. And that maintains the status quo. We need queer narratives of Asian men and women. We need narratives from adopted Asian, and Asian American people. We need narratives that are not just, I'm oppressed, right? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hartlep. There's so many stories I can tell, but we do have some time. I do want to give you all an opportunity to engage with him. I really appreciate your thought-provocative presentation. I think most of us, regardless of what race, gender, ethnicity we are, I think we are all at one point in time, on the receiving end of someone's stereotype, regardless of what your identity is. So I really appreciate that. I want to just give you another round of applause. I think some of the things you said and some of the things that Dr. Smith shared are really important, because I think as Asian Americans in particular, if we, I'm calling myself we, because if we're not part of the group that's on the high achieving end, then we have a very different kind of story that we have to tell. And you talk about how Tiger Mom, sold so many copies. She was everywhere talking about people wanting to know the secrets of how to raise successful children. And as I'm not an Asian mom, I don't have those secrets, right? But then what the other stories that often sell, you talk about moving beyond oppression stories, right? Some of our communities in the Asian American community, it has always been precisely those kinds of stories that have been told, right? The oppression stories, the gangsters, these are the types of stories that's all we ever hear about. So we are going to open up to questions that you may have for, I'll sort of moderate, but I don't really need to. So please just raise your hand and engage with them. Anyone? Questions? Comments? Stories?
It's hard to. I'm from a wealthier suburb of Milwaukee, and we are starting to have an Asian population. The problem that we're having, my daughter is half Japanese and presents as very Asian. The problem she has is exactly what you're talking about, is the model minority problem. So we have kids that are first generation, they're translating for their parents. Their parents are working, 14, 15 hours a day. Yet I feel like in the schools, the assumption is that they have no problems. They're doing well. They're maybe spending till 8, 9 o'clock at the local library. There may not be anybody to go home to for that reason. And I'm wondering how, if you have seen this problem before, and we're trying to figure out a way to advocate. But it's hard because we're also not able to communicate with parents, we're able to communicate with the students.
Yeah, so you touched on a lot of issues. I do think there is a class analysis that has to be carried out whenever talking about the model minority stereotype, in addition to issues of immigration and generation status. Because as Dr. Smith articulated in his introduction, right, they didn't know really there had to be class analysis. And I think of Amy Chua, who actually had family members, and I believe was raised for a portion of her life in Urbana-Champaign, near me. Silver spoon child, right? She has an endowed chair at Yale, and her husband does too, for law professors. And I think of the quote this coach that the name escapes me right now, but he said, there are a lot of folks who think they hit a home run and don't understand that we're born on third base. And so that's that complicity. I read about Asian complicity, that there are people that are profiting from the stereotype, and they're Asians themselves. But going to your question at hand, certainly latchkey and folks of Asian struggle, those need to be articulated. And there's a lot of literature on this. And I think of what happened at Harvard recently. Eldo Kim. Anyone in the audience heard about Eldo Kim? Eldo Kim was a student at Harvard, and fall semester he called in or emailed in a bomb threat. He attempted to elude authorities by using a false email address, and he was caught because the tech people could trace his IP. But he said there's a bomb, and he did that, at least evidence suggests, to evade having to take a final exam. And it's at that moment, right, that someone does the cost-benefit analysis and says, wow, I'm not prepared for this test, but I'll cram and I'll do the best of it. Or I will falsify a hoax, and now that's a federal offense, right? He's going to perhaps be in jail. The stress put on, right? But that's clearly a different issue than what you're saying of folks coming home to an empty home and having other problems. I think people, and it's interesting, I was invited to talk to some teachers in Massachusetts, and we're going to talk about these issues. Psychological issues, family issues, and you talked about language, children. In Filipino culture, the mom, I'm mispronouncing that, but it's the bridge generation, right? It's this idea that our back is our bridge and we're translating. That is those are hard issues to deal with, right? And grapple with. I think the K-12 administrators need to be in connection and in dialogue with folks who know about these issues to speak to those issues. But certainly they're affecting Milwaukee, they're affecting communities in Massachusetts, they're affecting even communities in Bloomington, which is very monoracial. But I have students who are undocumented Koreans in Bloomington, right? That they're like, Dr. Hartlep, how do I access when I become a teacher, get my licensure? Right? I don't have a social security number, right? And the DREAM Act and all of these things. These are real issues that need to be resolved. I don't have a smart response, though, to your question.
Okay.
Other comments and questions? Anyone?
We'll give wait time, as teachers have to wait. And if no one has a question, I'll think of a question to ask for you all. Because I can't do all the work. I'd rather tame the wild than raise the dead, so.
Oh, there's a question.
Oh, okay.
If you don't have the answer, but at least you have some kind of idea, the basic strategy, how to deal with this issue.
I didn't quite get the first part. How do we get speak to the issue of the mono-minority stereotype?
No, how to defend, like how to avoid the stereotype through a cultural story. I'm sorry, I came in late, so I catch it only to have,
I think you got it right. He wants to know what are strategies to deal with the mono-minority stereotype.
Is that what, to paraphrase, what are strategies? Okay, so there's a lot of strategies. Counter storytelling is one strategy, which is kind of what I talked about, is that there is a master narrative and then we push back and we kind of basically show how foolish this master narrative is through evidence. Certainly, statisticians have strategies, and one of the strategies that they continue to fall back on is disaggregation. In fact, a good colleague, Robert Teranishi, he was at NYU, but now he's at UCLA. He's undertaken much of this work in data disaggregation. If you look up on the internet, iReport, he's got iData, this whole initiative about disaggregation. The White House has initiatives, Anna Peasy's, institutions of higher education who are really focused on meeting the needs of Asian American and Asian Pacific Islanders serving institutions. That's more of a policy response. Lastly, I think another response is ourselves, And so I teach with my teachers, all my students are becoming teachers. I have them take an implicit association test. If any of you want to do them, they're free and they're online. I noticed some people are taking notes. If you write down Project Implicit, and you just go in and go to Yahoo or Google and you type in Project Implicit, at Harvard University, they have these modules, and you can take and select from a variety of biases an exam, and it will diagnose and tell you if you are biased in one direction or the other. There's some around weight, there's some around Asian, some on black, some on homophobia, and others. There's, I think, 12. And that is a very, I think, a revealing thing to do, because when you do it, it's just your results in you, and you have to make sense of that. And so when my students take those implicit association tests, and then they have to journal about, well, make sense of your responses. It's a will say, well, I'm not surprised because I was raised in a very monocultural, monoracial community, or I have had limited cross-cultural experiences. And others say, oh, of course I would come back non-biased because I have a family member who is gay, and so I know heteronormativity, and I understand my biases. So that's another strategy. I'm sure there's many more. That's the key, though, in this area that we're trying to develop strategies. Do you have any strategies, do you think, that I haven't talked about in terms of pushing back on the stereotype? Because I'd love to hear from others.
If you know it, not very positive. I mean, you know, sometimes maybe the philosophy embedded in me, okay, because I think that a lot of issues might be not worth it, taking into consideration of your life. You know, there are short time that we live on this earth, and something I think